The snow was thin that morning. A pale sheet stretched across the Alabama hills, softening the fences and guard towers of Camp Aliceville. The war in Europe was over, but its ghosts lingered here, behind barbed wire, where hundreds of captured German soldiers waited for a home that no longer existed. They moved like shadows in gray coats, their boots crunching softly in the frost. Some carved wooden toys. Others stared at the horizon, as if the clouds might part and reveal the fatherland once more. Silence was their language now. At the edge of the compound, an American officer escorted a small group of civilians, townsfolk curious to see the enemy up close. Among them, a boy no older than 6 clutched a list of prisoner names his teacher had given him. He could barely read them, stumbling through the harsh syllables, and then a word left his lips, a name. A German name. Behind the wire, one soldier froze. His head lifted slowly, eyes widening as the sound crossed the air. For the first time since surrendering on a ruined French road, his mouth curved upward. Not mockery, not disbelief. A fragile smile, born from hearing his own name spoken by an innocent voice. That moment, unnoticed by most, marked something profound. The first flicker of humanity returning to a man the war had buried. By early 1945, the war that had engulfed the world for 6 years was beginning to fracture under its own weight. Hitler's Reich, once a thunderous empire stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the gates of Moscow, was crumbling. Town by town, field by field, the Allies pushed inward. In the Ardennes, the last German offensive had failed. The skies over Germany were black with Allied bombers, and the armies of a broken nation began to surrender by the thousands. For the United States, this created a new challenge. What to do with the flood of prisoners now crossing the Atlantic? From North Africa, from Italy, from Normandy and beyond, ships carried men in gray uniforms, disarmed, defeated and bewildered, to ports in New York, Virginia, Texas, and Louisiana. By the end of the war, over 425,000 German prisoners of war would be held on American soil, scattered across more than 600 camps. These camps were not built as instruments of punishment. The United States, adhering to the 1929 Geneva Convention, sought to maintain a standard of humane treatment, a decision both moral and practical. German POWs were to receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. They could write letters, work, and even form orchestras or theater groups within camp limits. The goal was simple yet revolutionary for a world still burning: to prove that democracy could defeat fascism not only on the battlefield, but in mercy. The prisoners arrived by train, hands bound loosely, eyes shielded from the curious gaze of American civilians. Many expected cruelty, revenge for the horrors unleashed by their own army in Europe. Instead, they found themselves in small towns, near cornfields and railroads, guarded by young Americans who were often barely older than they were. One such place was Camp Aliceville, Alabama, built in 1942 and soon home to over 6,000 German soldiers. Among them, Africa Corps veterans, submarine officers, and young conscripts captured in the final years of the war. The camp sprawled across 400 acres, surrounded by pine forests and the low hum of southern farmland. It was, to many prisoners, a surreal prison, clean, orderly, and strangely calm. Life within its fences was a paradox. For men who had fought under Hitler's banners, the war had ended, but not their battle with guilt and identity. Some still clung to the ideology that had led them there. Others felt relief to have survived it at all. Days passed with strict military precision, roll calls, inspections, work details, and the quiet routine of survival. Yet beyond the wire, America was changing. Towns that had once feared invasion now hosted thousands of former enemies. Children grew up hearing foreign accents in the fields. Local farmers, short on labor, began to hire POWs to harvest crops under supervision. Slowly, suspicion gave way to curiosity. These were not monsters, people began to realize. Just men, lost in a war that none of them had truly won. Across the ocean, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The Red Army closed on Berlin from the east. American forces crossed the Rhine from the west. Millions were dead, cities lay in ruins, and yet, in the stillness of the American countryside, the war's final chapter was being written not in gunfire, but in quiet gestures, in the daily encounters between captor and captive, enemy and neighbor. It was in such a place, within one of these camps, that a single human moment would unfold. the kind of moment that no victory parade could ever capture. But before that morning came, the world had to pass through one last, dark season, the collapse of Germany and the moral reckoning that followed. Inside the barbed wire fences of America's prisoner of war camps, time became elastic. Days stretched endlessly under the southern sun, measured by the clang of mess hall bells and the soft echo of boots in formation. For many German prisoners, the end of the war felt less like freedom and more like exile, a suspension between worlds. Their homeland lay in ruins. Letters from Europe arrived sporadically, censored and worn. Some bore the news that towns were gone, that families had vanished in the bombings, that wives and children had fled before the advancing Soviet army. Others contained nothing but silence, months of unanswered hope. In this vacuum, the camps became entire worlds unto themselves, fragments of a lost Germany transplanted into the American heartland. At Camp Aliceville, the guards observed a curious phenomenon. The Germans brought with them a strict sense of order. They organized their barracks with military precision. They built small gardens between the huts, crafted furniture from scrap wood, even painted murals on the canteen walls. Each act of creation was a rebellion against despair. The U.S. Army encouraged work and education programs within the camps. Prisoners who had been engineers, teachers, or artists before the war began to teach their fellow inmates. Language classes, carpentry workshops, orchestras, and even makeshift newspapers filled the long months. The Americans called it re-education, but to many prisoners it was something simpler: survival through purpose. Outside the wire, life continued. In nearby towns, farmers noticed how hard the Germans worked, how meticulously they repaired fences, built barns, or harvested cotton. Under armed supervision, POW labor filled the gap left by young American men still fighting in the Pacific. Some locals began to greet the prisoners, exchange words, even share food. Small acts of kindness filtered through the boundaries of war. Yet not all wounds healed easily. For some Americans, those who had lost sons or brothers in Europe, the sight of a German uniform stirred anger and grief. They could not understand how these men, once instruments of the enemy, now ate well and slept safely while so many American soldiers never came home. But others saw something else: the futility of endless hatred. Inside the camp, evenings brought a strange quiet. In the barracks, men wrote in small notebooks, sketching the faces of home or copying poems by Goethe and Rilke. Others lay awake, haunted by memories of battlefields, North Africa, Normandy, the Eastern Front. They carried the weight of orders obeyed, of things seen and done in a war that had lost all meaning long before its end. As months passed, the sharp edges of enmity began to dull. The Americans who guarded the camps realized that most of these men were not the fanatical ideologues of propaganda. They were farmers, clerks, musicians, conscripts. They bled and feared like anyone else. Christmas 1944 brought a quiet truce of its own. Guards allowed the prisoners to build a small nativity scene from cardboard and cloth. A choir sang Stille Nacht under the dim light of lanterns. Some Americans stopped by, standing silently outside the wire listening. For a moment, the war seemed impossibly far away. By the spring of 1945, rumors of Germany's collapse spread through the camps like wind through pine trees. When the official news arrived, Hitler dead, Berlin fallen, many prisoners wept. Not for the regime, but for the realization that their country, their cities, their families were gone. Defeat was no longer an abstract word. It was ashes. And yet, amid that despair, something began to change. The American guards treated them not as enemies but as men. Food was shared. Injuries were tended. In workshops, POWs carved wooden toys for local children, gifting them as tokens of goodwill. It was here, in these exchanges, that the boundaries between victor and vanquished began to blur. It was through one of these small gestures, a visiting family, a curious child, and a simple list of names, that a frozen soldier, hollowed by war and loss, would find a single reason to remember who he was. 1. The human angle. For the German prisoners, the war had ended, but the struggle for meaning had only begun. Behind the wire, their uniforms were stripped of insignia, their purpose dissolved. They were soldiers without a country, men defined by defeat. Many had fought since youth, on frozen Russian steppes, in deserts beneath African suns, in the rubble of France. They had marched for a cause they barely understood, driven by orders, fear, or loyalty to comrades. Now in captivity, the slogans that once filled their lives were gone. What remained was silence. Yet within that silence lived something irrepressible, the human need to be recognized, to still have a name and identity when the war had erased everything else, to be called not enemy or kraut but by one's true name, the word that once carried the sound of home. Among these men, some clung to dignity through routine. They polished their boots though no one inspected them. They folded their uniforms with precision, as if the act itself could preserve a fragment of order. Others broke quietly under the weight of guilt for those they had lost or for the atrocities whispered through rumor and memory. A few found solace in letters. The Red Cross delivered mail, though many envelopes bore stamps from destroyed towns. Some opened them with trembling hands, discovering words scrawled by strangers who had found their families' remains. Others received nothing, and nothing was sometimes worse. In that emotional wasteland, small mercies became lifelines. A kind word from a guard, a cup of coffee offered without suspicion, the sound of laughter from outside the fence. These were reminders that even after war one could still belong to the world of the living. And so when the child spoke that name, his name, it wasn't simply a sound. It was proof that he still existed, that somewhere beyond the wire humanity remembered him. The American angle to the people of small-town America. The war had always been distant thunder, heard across oceans, visible only through ration stamps, newspaper headlines, and the empty chairs of sons gone overseas. When German prisoners arrived, the thunder became flesh. At first, many townsfolk were wary. Propaganda had painted these men as ruthless machines, the face of tyranny itself. Mothers kept their children indoors. Farmers tightened their grips on rifles. Churches whispered prayers for safety. But then the work programs began. POWs, escorted by U.S. guards, were sent into the fields to harvest cotton, pick fruit, and repair bridges. The farmers expected resistance. Instead, they found precision and respect. The Germans worked diligently, often singing as they labored. They fixed broken plows and rebuilt fences with an efficiency born of desperation, a need to prove that they were more than what the war had made them. It didn't take long for curiosity to replace fear. Local women brought water to the work crews. Children waved from porches. Some guards, seeing the civility of their captives, began to question their own hatred. Many realized that the lines dividing enemy from friend were drawn not in nature, but in propaganda and grief. Still, not everyone could forgive. Veterans returning from Europe sometimes visited the camps, staring across the wire at the men who had once tried to kill them. Some spat on the ground. Others remained silent, unable to reconcile the sight of a clean-shaven prisoner with the blood-soaked battlefield still haunting their minds. Yet America, even in war, was a land built on ideal, one of them being mercy. The decision to treat prisoners humanely was not just a policy. It was a statement of national character. It said that civilization would not sink to the level of barbarity it fought to destroy. That ethos trickled down into the smallest interactions. When local schools organized visits to the camp as educational goodwill gestures, they brought with them the next generation, children who knew no hatred, only curiosity. And among those children was the one who would speak a stranger's name and unknowingly reach across a chasm of war. The child's angle, the boy did not understand war. He knew only that his father wore a uniform, that his mother listened to the radio with a worried face, and that sometimes the town church rang its bells for men who never came home. To him, the camp was a mystery, a place his teacher described as full of soldiers who had lost. When the school arranged a visit, he went because he was curious. The children were told to bring gifts, letters, drawings, or lists of names to practice reading German words aloud, a simple exercise meant to show goodwill. The boy could barely pronounce them. Harsh foreign syllables that sounded like the wind through broken glass. But when he reached one name, Friedrich Müller, he felt it roll differently off his tongue, almost musical. Across the wire, a man's head turned. Their eyes met for a brief, timeless second, a child looking at a soldier looking at a child. Neither saw an enemy. The boy only saw a man with tired eyes. The man saw innocence untouched by hate. When the child finished reading, the soldier smiled. Not out of joy, but recognition. A spark of humanity reflected back at him from the last place he expected to find it. The guards noticed. The teacher did not. The boy didn't even know he had done something extraordinary. But within that fragile smile lay the quiet proof that compassion could survive captivity. The leadership angle, commanding a prisoner of war camp, was never simple. American officers stood at a crossroads of military discipline and humanitarian duty. Their orders were clear: prevent escape, maintain order, uphold the Geneva Convention. Yet in practice, they were stewards of something far more delicate: the humanity of their captives. At camps like Aliceville or Concordia, leadership became an exercise in restraint. Many officers had fought in Europe and carried their own scars. They had seen what German armies had done, in France, in Belgium, in the ruins of Poland. And now they were responsible for feeding and protecting those same soldiers. It demanded a rare kind of moral discipline. Colonel Clarence Williams, commandant of Camp Aliceville, often reminded his men that a prisoner's behavior mirrors his treatment. Under his guidance, guards were instructed to treat prisoners with respect, firm, but not cruel. Violations of that standard were swiftly punished. The colonel understood that to win the peace, America had to prove its principles were more than propaganda. Inside the wire, German officers mirrored this code. They kept their men organized, enforced camp rules, and discouraged defiance. It was less loyalty to the Reich than to structure itself, the one thing that gave meaning amid uncertainty. Many had led troops across continents. Now they led men through monotony. Occasionally tensions flared. Escape attempts, ideological disputes, the presence of unrepentant Nazis among those who had simply been soldiers. American officers walked a fine line between control and compassion. The best of them realized that the real battle inside those fences was not against the enemy's body, but for his conscience. That leadership philosophy trickled downward. It shaped the atmosphere that allowed gestures of empathy, like the child's, to exist safely. In a lesser command, it might have been forbidden or misinterpreted. But in camps governed by dignity, such moments became quiet affirmations that war could end without hate, consuming everything it touched. The psychological angle war strips men of their humanity. Captivity tests whether it can ever return. For the German POWs, the first months in America were marked by disorientation. They had been told that defeat meant annihilation, that Allied soldiers were monsters who would enslave or execute them. When they arrived and found clean barracks, medical care, and decent food, the contrast created deep internal conflict. Some refused to believe it, convinced it was an illusion. Others broke down entirely, overwhelmed by guilt and confusion. The dissonance between Nazi indoctrination and American kindness tore through them. Many began to question everything they had been taught. Psychologists later described this period as cognitive disarmament, when ideological armor begins to crack. It was not propaganda that changed them, but lived experience. Watching guards treat them fairly, seeing American civilians show decency, hearing children laugh nearby, all of it eroded the mental walls built by years of hate. The Americans, too, were learning. For young guards raised on wartime propaganda, seeing their enemies cry over letters from home or share family photos was disarming in its own right. Sympathy began to replace suspicion. This mutual unraveling of fear was subtle but transformative. By late 1944, reports from camp psychologists noted an increasing normalization of morale. German prisoners participated in sports, art, and correspondence courses. Some even requested English Bibles, eager to understand the culture that had treated them with such unexpected grace. And yet, the trauma ran deep. Nightmares were common. Survivors of the Eastern Front carried scars invisible to the eye. Some whispered prayers for fallen comrades. Others avoided speaking at all. The smile that emerged from hearing one's name spoken was not just a reflex. It was the first step toward reclaiming identity from the psychological wreckage of total war. The moral angle history often measures wars in victories and losses, but the moral weight of conflict lingers long after the shooting stops. The existence of German POWs on American soil forced the United States to confront a profound question. How does a democracy treat its defeated enemies? In Europe, Atrocities on both sides had revealed the fragility of civilization under fire. But across the ocean, the U.S. had an opportunity to demonstrate something different: the triumph of values over vengeance. Every meal served to a German prisoner, every fair trial, every letter allowed to pass through the Red Cross was a quiet assertion that law and humanity still mattered. This approach carried risks. Critics argued that America was being too lenient, that kindness toward captives dishonored the memory of those killed in battle. Newspapers debated whether the Geneva Convention should apply to men who had fought for tyranny. But leaders like General Eisenhower understood the long view. Today's prisoner could become tomorrow's advocate for peace. In many cases, they did. Years later, countless former POWs would recall their time in American camps as transformative, the moment they began to see democracy not as an enemy, but as a model. The seeds of post-war reconciliation were planted not in conferences or treaties, but in small acts of fairness. The moral angle, then, was not about absolution. It was about balance, justice without cruelty, victory without humiliation. It was about a child's voice cutting through the echoes of propaganda, reminding both sides that human beings could still recognize one another through the smoke of war. That fragile thread, stretched between innocence and guilt, would soon tighten into a single, unforgettable moment, the smile that broke through the ruins of identity. It was a gray morning in early winter, 1945. The Alabama air held the sharp chill of coming rain, the kind that softened the edges of sound and smell. Camp Aliceville stirred awake as it always did, guards making their rounds, prisoners lining up for roll call, boots crunching on frozen gravel. For most men inside, days had blurred together. They rose, worked, ate, and slept within the same fences. Seasons changed, but nothing else did. The war was over, yet they still lived inside its shadow. At the far end of the compound stood Barrack 12B, home to older veterans, men who had served under Rommel's Africa Corps and had survived the long retreat from Tunisia. Among them was Friedrich Müller, once a schoolteacher before the war, captured in 1943 after the fall of Bizerte. 2 years in captivity had worn away his posture and voice. He spoke little, worked in the carpentry shed, and kept to himself. His comrades called him Der Lehrer, the teacher, a man whose mind had gone quiet. That morning, the prisoners were told to gather near the southern fence. A group of American civilians had arrived, teachers, church members, and several children, part of a post-war goodwill initiative. They carried letters, hand-knit scarves, and notes of peace written by local students. The Germans stood in formation, uncertain. Some smiled politely, others stared at the ground. It was not humiliation they feared, but the awkward weight of kindness. To be pitied by one's enemy was sometimes harder than to be hated. An American officer stepped forward and greeted them in slow, deliberate German. Then he invited the children to speak. One by one, they read from papers prepared by their teacher. Short sentences of greeting, practiced phonetically. Their accents were clumsy, but their sincerity disarmed even the most stoic prisoners. Each word carried warmth that discipline couldn't suppress. The adults watched in silence, caught between pride and confusion. Then came the smallest boy, hair combed neatly, shoes too big for his feet. He held a paper with trembling hands. His teacher whispered encouragement. He began reading. The names were foreign, tangled on his tongue. Kurt, Hans, Otto. The prisoner's eyes followed his lips, uncertain what this exercise meant. Some smiled faintly at the mispronunciations. The air was still, no sound but his small voice cutting through the cold. Then, without warning, the boy said a name clearly, perfectly, Friedrich Müller. The words hung in the air like a bell tone. Müller froze. His head snapped up as if the sound had struck him. His comrades turned. The boy looked confused by the reaction. He had simply read the next name. For Müller, it was not a name on a list. It was him, a word he hadn't heard spoken with tenderness in years, not barked by officers, not recorded on documents, spoken, recognized, human. Something inside him broke, not in pain, but release. His lips parted and his face, once set in stone, softened. A small, hesitant smile crept across it. It was awkward, almost childlike. His eyes glistened, not with tears of weakness, but relief, the rediscovery of being seen. Guards noticed. The American officer did too. None interfered. They understood instinctively that this was something sacred. a quiet truce drawn between two worlds. The boy looked up, puzzled but pleased that his reading had drawn attention. His teacher smiled approvingly, unaware of the silent storm she had unleashed in one man's heart. The moment passed quickly. The list continued. Children read. Adults clapped. The event moved on. But for Müller, time had stopped at the sound of his own name. Later, when the crowd left and the gates closed again, he stood near the fence long after everyone else had gone. His hands trembled slightly. One of his comrades approached and asked softly, "Was war das?" "What was that?" Müller replied almost in a whisper. Hat mich erinnert. He remembered me. It didn't matter that the boy had never known him before. The act of speaking his name had pulled him out of the faceless mass of war and back into existence. In that fragile instant, something shifted inside the camp, a small fracture in the wall between captor and captive. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the first flicker of shared humanity, and once seen, it could not be unseen. That fragile smile, born in silence, would ripple beyond the barbed wire, carried by memory, by story, by the men who witnessed it. It would become a symbol of what remained possible when the world believed it was beyond repair. And yet that moment was not the end of the story. In the hours and days that followed, its meaning deepened, spreading through the camp, through the men, through the conscience of all who had seen it. The day after the visit, something in Camp Aliceville felt subtly changed. The men could not name it, but it hung in the air. In the way voices carried, in the way faces met each other's eyes again. For 2 years, Friedrich Müller had moved through the camp like a ghost. He worked in the carpentry shed, shaping wood without speaking, carving toys for other men's children, faceless dolls, wooden horses, small ships that would never sail. But now, as he sat at his workbench, his hands paused. The tools felt different. The wood beneath his fingers was warm again, alive. That evening, his barrack companions noticed him humming, quietly, a half-forgotten tune from his village near Bremen. It startled them. They hadn't heard him make a sound beyond orders or polite replies since Tunisia. Word spread through the camp. The teacher smiled. Men came to his bench out of curiosity. Some teased him lightly. Others simply nodded in respect. For them, his smile was not trivial. It was a reminder that something inside them could still be repaired. In the days that followed, Müller's behavior changed in small but steady ways. He began helping other prisoners write letters, translating for younger men who struggled with English. He taught basic arithmetic to those who had never finished school before the war. His barrack became a small classroom again. The American guards noticed the shift too. Sergeant Thomas, who had long seen Müller as one of the quiet ones, found himself lingering by the workshop more often. He watched as the German showed another prisoner how to shape wood with careful precision. It reminded the sergeant of his own father, who had been a carpenter before the Depression. One afternoon, Thomas approached Müller with a cautious smile. "You were a teacher, weren't you?" he asked in broken German. Müller looked up surprised. "Yeah, before the war." The sergeant nodded slowly. "Good work. Useful work." They didn't speak much more. But that exchange, brief, respectful, bridged a gap wider than any fence. Across the camp, other guards began softening too. They still carried rifles, still enforced rules, but something about their eyes had changed. The war felt farther away now, replaced by a sense that perhaps these men were no longer enemies, only remnants of a storm that had passed. The camp's commandant, Colonel Williams, noticed the transformation and later wrote in his journal, "These men arrived broken, hollowed by ideology and defeat. Yet within the simplest acts and a word spoken, a name remembered, I have seen more reconciliation than all treaties combined." As for the boy who had unknowingly spoken Müller's name, he went home that evening chattering to his mother about the tall man who smiled. He didn't understand the gravity of what he'd done. To him, it was a day of reading strange words and seeing men in uniforms that didn't fit. But his mother noticed his excitement. The lightness of a child who had felt kindness returned. Weeks passed. The weather warmed. Prisoners began planting small gardens outside their barracks, coaxing life from Alabama soil. Müller tended a row of sunflowers, bright yellow faces that turned toward the morning light. When the Americans asked why he chose that flower, he answered simply, "Because they always look up." The transformation was not confined to Miller. His comrades, watching him rediscover purpose, began to change too. The bitterness that had long haunted the camp seemed to dissolve. Conversations grew warmer. Laughter returned quietly at first, then freely. Even the guards, once wary of sentiment, began to see the camp not as a prison but as a waiting room for renewal. Months later, as Germany's reconstruction began, the War Department prepared for mass repatriations. Notices were read aloud, names of men who would soon be sent home. When Miller's name was called, he rose calmly. But before he left, he approached the American officer at the gate, the same one who had hosted the civilian visit that day. He handed the man a small wooden box. Inside lay a toy carved from scrap pine, a tiny horse perfectly shaped. On the underside, etched carefully in German, were the words, "Für das Kind, das mich erinnerte." For the child who remembered me. The officer nodded, moved beyond words. He kept the box on his desk for years. When Miller finally returned to Germany, he found his hometown bombed, his school gone, his family scattered. Yet he carried something intangible back with him, the memory of a moment that had restored his faith in decency. He would later write in a letter to a fellow prisoner, "It was not freedom that returned me to myself. It was being seen, and by those who had no reason to care." That sentence, though few ever read it, captured the essence of that forgotten day. For a man who had lost everything, home, purpose, and belief, hearing his name from the lips of a child had done what victory, ideology, and war could not. It made him human again, and in that humanity, fragile but real, the war truly ended, not in the halls of surrender, but in the quiet recognition between a child and a captive. By 1946, the barbed wire of America's POW camps was slowly coming down. The war was over, the world was realigning, and the men who had once worn the enemy's uniform were being prepared for return to a homeland unrecognizable from the one they had left. But something unexpected had taken root in the soil of those camps, something that would outlast their fences. Respect. Across the United States, reports from camp commandants painted a similar picture. German prisoners, initially sullen and defensive, had transformed. They had built orchestras, published camp newspapers, and taken correspondence courses offered by American universities. They had learned English, studied democracy, and in many cases begun to question the ideology that had led them to war. This was no accident. It was policy, a deliberate strategy shaped by American leadership. The War Department, under guidance from the Office of the Provost Marshal General, had decided early that German POWs would be treated according to the highest standards of the Geneva Convention. It was a moral statement, but also a psychological one. The United States sought not just to defeat Nazism militarily, but to dismantle it intellectually, through decency. Each camp became a small experiment in moral reconstruction. German prisoners attended lectures on American history, government, and freedom of speech. In some, films were shown depicting the liberation of concentration camps, stark, unfiltered evidence of what their government had done. The reactions were varied: disbelief, denial, horror. But for many, it was the first time truth pierced the armor of propaganda. For the Americans involved, the transformation was equally profound. Guards who had arrived with hardened hearts left with a sense of empathy they hadn't expected. Many wrote home that they could no longer hate the men behind the wire. "They're like us," one corporal wrote to his wife. "They bleed, laugh, and talk about home the same way I do." Moments like Müller's own, small, human, unrecorded, were the quiet machinery of this transformation. They proved that ideology could be undone not by force, but by kindness. When the first ships carrying POWs departed for Europe in late 1945, something remarkable happened. Thousands of prisoners wrote letters of gratitude to the American people. They thanked guards, teachers, and townsfolk for their treatment. Some left behind carved gifts, toys, jewelry, or handmade furniture. In a war defined by hatred, these tokens became evidence of something extraordinary: reconciliation born from humanity. Not all Americans approved. Newspapers ran letters from citizens asking why the enemy was being coddled while rationing continued at home. Families of fallen soldiers sometimes protested the generosity shown to their former foes. Yet the higher command held firm. The moral authority of the United States, they believed, depended on proving that even victory could be just. When Miller's transport ship departed from New York Harbor, he stood on deck beside hundreds of other men, thin, pale, but alive. The Statue of Liberty stood in the distance, her torch faint in the morning haze. He did not see her as a symbol of conquest but of contrast. He had fought for a regime that worshipped fear. Now he was leaving a land that had answered it with fairness. The Atlantic stretched before him like a mirror of memory. Behind him lay captivity. Ahead, the ruins of his homeland. But somewhere between he carried something unbroken. The echo of a child's voice saying his name. That voice had become, for him and many others, the first sound of peace, and yet, the story did not end when the ships reached Europe. The true aftermath of that humane experiment would unfold in the years to come, shaping post-war Germany, rebuilding trust, and influencing how nations approach their enemies for generations. When Friedrich Müller set foot on German soil again in the summer of 1946, he was no longer the same man who had been captured 3 years before. The air smelled of ash and damp earth. His homeland was broken, its cities skeletal, its streets filled with silence, and its people worn thin by hunger and shame. The once proud teacher walked through what had been Bremen's old quarter, where his school had stood. Only the foundations remained. Children played among the rubble, their laughter echoing through hollowed buildings. There were no flags now, no parades, only survival. Müller soon learned that many of his former students had died in air raids or on the Eastern Front. His wife and son had fled east during the bombings, their fate uncertain, yet even as despair closed in, he carried something rare, a fragment of light from across the ocean. He began teaching again, this time in makeshift classrooms built from salvaged brick and timber. His lessons were different now. He no longer taught obedience or order. He taught memory, ethics, and the fragility of human decency. When students asked him about the war, he did not speak of glory. He spoke of the day an American child said his name. His story spread quietly among the townspeople, a tale of kindness that felt almost impossible amid the ruin. Others like him told similar stories, of fair treatment, of Americans who had shared food, of guards who had spoken gently instead of shouting. These recollections became the first seeds of something Germany had forgotten: trust. Across the country, millions of returning prisoners shared such memories. They became living bridges between defeated Germany and a world that had every reason to hate it. Many became educators, mayors, and reformers in the decades to come. Some helped rebuild schools and universities. Others worked with Allied reconstruction teams. Historians later observed that these men, shaped by their experiences in American camps, were among the first to embrace democracy. Not because it was imposed, but because they had lived its compassion firsthand. For Müller, the transformation was personal, not political. He corresponded for years with the American officer who had overseen his camp. Their letters, respectful, reflective, spoke of hope and forgiveness. In one, he wrote, "You gave us back the right to be human before we had earned it. That is why we must never lose it again." In the late 1950s, a small package arrived at the officer's home in Alabama. Inside was a photograph. Müller, gray-haired, standing in front of a rebuilt schoolhouse with a group of smiling children. On the back he had written in careful English, "To you, and to the child who spoke my name. The world is learning again." The officer kept that photograph beside the wooden horse Müller had carved. Long after both men had grown old, as decades passed, the memory of the POW camps faded from public consciousness, but their legacy lived quietly within the architecture of peace. When the United States later shaped its policies of post-war reconstruction, from the Marshall Plan to humanitarian aid in later conflicts, it drew on the same principle proven in those camps: that victory without compassion is only another form of loss. By the time Müller died in the early 1970s, Germany had transformed. Its economy was thriving, its democracy stable, and its people no longer defined by the darkness of their past. Yet in the final pages of his diary, recovered by his students, he wrote, "What healed us were not speeches, nor laws, nor punishments. It was mercy, unexpected, undeserved, but real." In that sentence lies the quiet truth of his smile. that a war ending in ruin could still give birth to grace, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the weight of redemption. History records wars in dates and numbers. It counts the dead, measures the victories, names the battles. But history often forgets the moments that truly healed the world, the ones that didn't thunder through gunfire, but whispered through kindness. Friedrich Müller's smile was one such whisper. It belonged to no battlefield, no speech, no treaty. It was born in silence, inside a camp where an enemy remembered how to be human again. That child who spoke his name did not end a war. He simply reminded one man that he still existed beyond it. Yet that act, unrecorded and unplanned, carried more weight than many acts of vengeance. It proved that peace is not declared. It is recognized, one soul at a time. The moral architecture of the post-war world was built on lessons like this: the humane treatment of prisoners, the reconstruction of nations, the belief that dignity could outlive destruction. All these ideas were not born in conferences, but in ordinary people choosing decency when it was least expected. For Müller, that moment behind the wire was the rediscovery of identity. For the boy, it was the discovery of compassion. For both, it was the beginning of peace. Even now, in a world still fractured by conflict, the echo of that day remains. It reminds us that reconciliation does not begin with grand gestures, but with something far smaller: a word, a name, a smile that says, "I see you," because in the end, history is not only the story of what we destroy, it is also the story of what we choose to rebuild, in others and in ourselves. And sometimes all it takes to rebuild a man, a memory, or a world is for someone, somewhere, to simply speak his name.